Have you been thinking about launching a podcast for your business, but not sure where to begin or what to do? I'm Morentin, host of Podcast Marketing Secrets and CEO of Video Podcast Pros. In this episode, I'm going to cover the necessary steps to launch a proper business podcast that gets you more clients and more sales with less stress. I'll cover the 4 stages of creating a business podcast, including building out the foundation, the tech setup, podcast build-out, and podcast launch. So let's get into it. Okay, I'm going to make this document a little bit bigger so you can see it better. All right, so hopefully you could read that. So as mentioned, there's 4 different stages to building and launching a podcast. The foundation, where you actually create the infrastructure and design of the podcast, the tech setup, the podcast build-out, and the podcast launch. So first off, you want to start off with your goals. What is the goal of the podcast? What do you want to get more leads, make more sales, etc.? That's usually the goals of a business podcast. And then the release schedule. What day of the week are you going to release the podcast? Are you going to do it every week? Are you going to do it twice a month? Are you going to do it twice a week? You make that decision so you could stay on point and have a guideline for yourself, but also it helps the listener or the viewer to have something to look forward to, and you having the consistency of releasing podcasts on specific days of the week or a month, time in and time out, that helps people to know, like, and trust you and make them want to do business with you. Okay. So after that, you want to create some calls to action, whether it's driving people to a website landing page, getting a lead magnet, etc. Like you want to have like an actual result from the podcast episodes, by having calls to action. You don't just want to do episodes blindly. It's best to have those calls to action. I like to do like 3. You want to have at least 1, but having 2 or 3 is optimal, so you could switch them out. You could even have calls to action at the beginning of the podcast, at the end of the podcast, and they could be different if you have more than 1. Okay, so very, very, very beneficial to have those calls to action ready to go, and so they can be delivered within your podcast episodes. Next is the intro and outro. So you make like an outline for your intro and outro to make it easy for you to do it with each episode that you do. So it's more like a rinse and repeat kind of a thing instead of trying to reinvent the wheel with every episode. Next up is having cover art. So you have cover art for the podcast episode itself, the audio version, but you also want to have for your YouTube channel, if you're doing the video podcast, which I really highly recommend, then you want to have cover art for that as well, and have it cohesive with the cover art for the audio podcast. And then also with your social media accounts, it's good to have cohesive cover art for them as well. So no matter where they land on, they know they're in the right place, and that they are being in contact with you. Okay. After that, we go over the description, like the written description of the podcast itself. So in your description, you would include a variety of things, including the what the podcast is all about, who it's for, the release schedule, who you are, why you started the podcast, etc. All vital things to include in the written description. After that, you want to decide the structure of the podcast. I like to segment the podcast into different pieces, so it's like bite-sized chunks that you have to create. So it's not a big burden doing this big, huge thing all at once. You just do little chunks, and then we just put them together in post-production, right, to make this one cohesive podcast. But the segments make it easier to produce, initially. Also, it's something that's sort of fun for the listeners or viewers, so they know the different segments, and they might have one segment that they come to just for that segment, right? So you're going to be hitting people in different ways and be able to capture more long-time viewers and listeners by segmenting the podcast as opposed to just trying to vomit out this big long episode every month or every week, right? And it makes you have much less stress when it's done that way as well, as that's what we found over the years. After after the foundation is laid out, then you go into the tech setup. So the hardware, what hardware are you gonna use? Do you have some already? Do you need to get some more, different, the microphone, the headphones, the recording software, etc. So, so there's the hardware, and then there's the software, the decisions that need to be made for each of those. And we do that during this phase. The next step is the RSS feeds. You need to make the decision on, which RSS feeds you're going to be using and the directories that they're going to be promoted out to as well. So making that decision during the tech setup phase makes life easier down the road during the podcast build out and podcast launch. Next up is the hosting. There's a variety of hosting platforms that you can choose from. There's a ton of them. Some are free, some are paid. Which one is right for your particular situation. And then post-production workflow. So that's after the podcast is recorded, what's going to be done afterwards? How is it going to be produced, and do a cohesive episode, taking the intro, the outro, the actual meat of the podcast itself, or the different segments, and putting them all together. Are you going to do that in-house? You're going to have somebody else do that? And how is it going to be done? So that workflow being created is super crucial for yourself, your team, and then anybody that you would hand it off to as well. Also, you want to have a guest workflow. So not just how to reach out to a person to get them on your show, but actually, who you're going to go after, and then, how you're going to go after them, and actually reaching out to them, how to follow up to them, and get them on board, what to do, between the time that they say yes and the time of the recording of the episode, how to interact with them during the episode, and then how to keep them, top of mind until the episode is actually produced and released, and the thank you emails, etc., and then how to get them to actually promote the podcast to their community, because that doesn't happen automatically. If you don't have an actual workflow on how to do this and how to get them to promote it to their community, then it won't happen. But if you do, then they will, and they will willingly do it. And you'll get more eyes on your podcast. You'll get more people in your community, and you'll be able to grow your business, get more clients, make more sales, have less stress, etc. All from building out these workflows in this initial tech setup phase. Okay, so lastly, with the tech setup, you want to decide which video players, which audio players you're going to be using on the website, on the blog, etc. After you're done with the foundation and the tech setup, then more of the fun stuff starts to happen with the podcast build out. So with the podcast build out, that's where you do what I call episode 0, which is the trailer. So you write, record, and edit the trailer, and that's sort of like the written description where it goes over what the podcast is all about, why you created it, who you are, in your industry, why you're positioned to be an authority figure, and dole out the information that they can consume, etc. You also have the release schedule that they can count on and that you're going to deliver on, etc. So a bunch of different things are included in the trailer. It's really important to get the right recipe for that, and then get it written out, record it, and edit it so it could be put onto the hosting platform in the next stage, right? And then the episode recording workflow. So this workflow is super important as well. How is it going to be recorded? When are you going to record it? So you have the release date, but how much before that release date are you going to record it? Are you going to batch them all and do all your episodes in one day? Are you going to do them one at a time? And then how is it going to be delivered out to the persons so they could do their post-production workflow? All of these different things are inside of the episode recording workflow. Okay, super important to have that, so you could have less stress with your podcast. You don't want it to be a burden. You want this to be an asset for your business that actually helps you to get more clients and make more sales, but not take up a bunch of time, right? And these workflows help to really streamline the process. So after you have all that done, build out the workflows, recorded the trailer, that's when you record your first episode. So that's super exciting, getting that first episode recorded. And then you hand it off to the post-production team, whether it's in-house or with somebody like Video Podcast Pros. And then you go into the hosting site setup. So we decided in the tech setup stage, which hosting platform is going to be used. So now we set the hosting platform up. It's with the cover art. You upload the trailer and episode, etc. So we just get all that, the description, all of the different assets that we've created or you've created, get uploaded and established on the hosting platform, and from there, that's how the places like Apple and Spotify, Amazon Music, etc. will get that onto their platforms, from your hosting platform. So as mentioned, after the hosting platform is set up, then you upload the trailer and the episode, and then we go into the website integration and setup. So are you going to use a standalone website just for the podcast? Are you going to integrate it into your existing website? What's the decision on that? And then how are you going to implement that? And then actually implementing it, because we're in the podcast build out phase. So super exciting area, and that's how you get more eyeballs and get more backlinks to your website, etc. From by having the podcast put embedded on there, and having links back from the podcast directories over to your website, over to your blog, over to whatever platform that you're utilizing. Okay, and then lastly, with the podcast build out is the social media setup. So which social media sites are you going to use to market your podcast with? So it's one of the key benefits of having a business podcast as opposed to like a hobby lifestyle podcast is we create a bunch of marketing assets, or you can create a bunch of marketing assets that can be blasted all over your email newsletter and your social media to drive back to the podcast episodes. And it's super crucial to do that because it'll basically 10x the performance of your podcast and 10x the results that you get from it. And those results, remember, are more clients, more sales. Okay, so very crucial for your business. Because remember, we want to get a result with the podcast, right? We don't just want to be posting out a bunch of episodes and say, hey, look at me, I have a podcast. We actually want to get a tangible result that ends up with, dollar signs in your bank account. Okay, so after the podcast build out is done, then we get into the real fun, the podcast launch. So, we create the RSS feeds, in the tech setup, we decided on which ones we're going to be created and the directories they're going to be blasted out to. But in the podcast launch, we actually create those RSS feeds for both video and audio. And then we also go over the blog setup, right? You want to have a blog setup for your podcast as well that could be on its own, it's on your website. And you usually will have like an article there, and then embed the podcast audio and podcast video onto the blog as well. So you have all three factors on there. I found that it's best to do this because you have the video so they could view, you have the audio so they could listen, and you have the article so they could read. So you're hitting people at whatever, like consumption factor they like to use. Some people like to read, some people like to listen, and some people like to view. Makes sense. After that, we go into submitting the feeds to all the various different platforms and directories, such as the Apple, YouTube, Amazon Music, Spotify, etc. You get those submitted and then accepted, so you can have your podcast onto those platforms. They actually need to be submitted and then accepted for each of them. Okay, and there can be like upwards of 100 different platforms to submit to. After that, then you launch the marketing strategy. Okay, so we created like the marketing strategy prior to this, and now we're going to launch that strategy across your all your social media platforms, your email newsletter, etc. So we can create excitement for the actual pre-launch and launch of the podcast. So during the pre-launch of the podcast, that's when we try to build up more excitement. You are building up a bunch of excitement for the actual launch date, and then that brings us to the launch of the podcast. So the launch of the podcast, you would want to do that on the release day. Like if you're doing it every Tuesday, then is your release day. Then you want to have the launch on a Tuesday. Okay, so that just gets people into the flow of your podcast from the get-go. But we don't do a launch podcast. At least I prefer not to. You can do it on one day, but I've found that it's best to do it over a 7-day period. Okay, and so you do it on the actual release day. Like I said, if it's a Tuesday, you do it on the Tuesday, and then you continue to promote it for 6 days after that. So a total of 7 days, and that maximizes the benefit, that maximizes your reach and engagement, which will actually, lead to getting the podcast, off the ground quicker, up and running quicker, and get more eyeballs, more subscribers, and more reviews and more interaction. And it also gets that know, like, and trust factor built out quicker, where you become that key person of influence. They know, like, and trust you, and makes them want to do business with you, or more people want to do business with you. Okay. After all of that, after we've done the foundation, tech setup, podcast build out, and podcast launch, you're on all cylinders, ready to go. We have all the workflows built out so you can stay consistent and persistent with your efforts. You're not just doing them randomly. You have a schedule and a flow that people depend on, and then you decide what's next. How are you going to keep up with this? Are you going to keep everything in house and have you and your team, do the production and post production? Are you going to hand it off to somebody like Video Podcast Pros, etc.? So you just want to make those decisions and, keep patient, persistent, and consistent with the efforts of the podcast, and get the best results from it. So you actually do get more clients, make more sales, retain clients longer, increase their lifetime value, ultimately have less stress in your life, and more money in your bank account. As you can see, a business podcast, along with its marketing assets, is a great way to get prospects into your ecosphere and greatly increases the prospects' time to value, where they quickly understand that you are a key person of influence and the obvious choice to help them. However, creating a podcast on your own with all the steps involved can be very time-consuming for a business owner. Time that would be better spent working on your business instead of in it. And that's why I created Video Podcast Pros. We take the burden of creating and launching a podcast off your plate, and we get your podcast launched quicker and better than you would on your own. It's what we do. If you're interested in finding out how we can help you launch your business podcast sooner than later, then click the link in the show notes to schedule a discovery call with us where we'll go over your options. In conclusion, a business podcast is a game-changing tool that can catapult your success and attract clients who seek you out. By establishing yourself as a key person of influence through your podcast and its associated marketing materials, you can build trust, credibility, and authority in your industry. So why wait? Start your podcasting journey today and unlock the doors to unlimited business growth and success. Remember to subscribe to Podcast Marketing Secrets on YouTube, Apple, or your favorite podcast listening platform to stay updated with the latest insights and strategies. You can also find us on YouTube and IG at The Podcast Marketer. This is Al Morentin with Podcast Marketing Secrets and Video Podcast Pros signing off. See you on the next episode.